It's at this point that Ted went from an active, healthy kid to an exceptionally smart but lonely teenager, aloof from his peers. During his brief but eventful time in school, Ted became extremely proficient at mathematics, being placed in advanced math classes and becoming one of his school's 5 national merit finalists, which fast-tracked his way into Harvard University. There, he spent an arts degree in mathematics, but in his second year, usual took place. Harvard psychologist Henry Murray was conducting a study where students were told they'd be debating philosophy with other students and had to prepare essays expounding other beliefs. Then, instead of debating using the information instead under the subject one of the undergrad asked by a stranger for his thoughts for no real reason whatsoever. While Ted resented Murray for feeling that he violated privacy by letting a random anonymous person read his essay, he didn't think this study had any long-lasting effects on his worldview and psyche. So, after he graduated Harvard, he applied to 3 other universities, all of which accepted him. But only one, the University of Michigan, offered him a teaching post and an additional annual grant of a little over $2,000, which would be worth $24,000 in today's money. While he did perform well during his time there, and pretty much every single faculty member that came in contact with him had only great things to say, he eventually described the 5 years he spent there as the worst 5 years of his life. And given he made that claim from inside of a prison, you can imagine how bad the university must have been. Regardless, his dissertation that year won a prize for the best dissertation of the year, and his director recognized his work as the best he'd ever done, despite acknowledging it was the kind of high-octane academic text that only a few people could even begin to appreciate. But one really odd detail about the time during which he was working on this dissertation is that over several weeks in 1966, Ted began having fantasies of being a female, going as far as to decide to transition and schedule a meeting with a psychiatrist to take the first steps toward that goal. It wasn't until he actually got to the psychiatrist's waiting room that he reconsidered, at which point he became deeply enraged at the mere thought of following through on his fantasies. He proceeded to speak to the psychiatrist, but neglected to mention any of the thoughts that had been troubling his mind, pretending instead to be depressed over the prospect of being drafted into the military. He eventually channeled his rage for his experience here in his writings, saying, "As I walked away from the building afterwards, I felt disgusted about what my uncontrolled cravings had almost led me to do, and I felt humiliated, and I violently hated the psychiatrist. Just then, there came a major turning point in my life. Like a phoenix, I burst from the ashes of my despair to a glorious new hope. I will kill, but I will make at least some effort to avoid detection so that I can kill again." These intentions to kill were first directed at the psychiatrist, and then to other people in his life whom he disliked. While he always enjoyed being close to nature over modern urban living, this is the first time where that preference escalated into a willingness to harm others, and it marks the beginning.
LegalZoom gives you step-by-step tools to set up your LLC quickly and confidently. If you're someone who wants to DIY it, LegalZoom's tools guide you through the process so that you know you're doing it right. And if you have questions, they have experts on hand to help you out. It's peace of mind and time saved so you can focus on exciting parts of your business, not the paperwork.
His ultimate undoing. His professional career, despite being promising as he came closer and closer to being a tenured professor, suddenly came to an end when he resigned in 1969. While he left behind an impressive legacy as not only the youngest Harvard professor for the time, but also having most, if not all, of his conjectures about mathematics proven to be true. Over the next couple of years, Ted first moved back in with his parents, and then to a house in the middle of the Montana wilderness, with no electricity or even clean running water. His income came from performing random tasks for people who lived nearby, but he needed very little in the first place, as the entire purpose of having moved out there was to become self-sufficient, to live off the land, to live off the grid. For the first few years of it, Ted lived peacefully, collecting books to continue his habit of studying. But this time it wasn't math, but instead sociology and political philosophy. But by 1975, his lifestyle took on a slightly more hostile nature, as Ted began setting up traps around his cabin to prevent invaders or outsiders in general from approaching it. One of the books he read happened to be The Technological Society by Jacques Ellul, and although that wasn't the intention of the author, it gave an articulate voice to Ted's lifelong skepticism skepticism of tech, setting him on a darker path. Eventually, in 1978, after plenty of experience jerry-rigging bizarre contraptions up around his house, Ted began carrying out his plan to strike out at the world that he'd come to see as moving forward too fast. And oddly, he picked Buckley Christ, a professor of materials engineering at Northwestern University, as his first victim. He did this by cleverly putting together an explosive package with a return address to Buckley and leaving it in a parking lot of another university. Fortunately, when it got to Buckley, he instantly recognized that he'd never mailed that package, and being suspicious that it could contain drugs, he had a campus police officer handle it instead, which, although it resulted in the detonation of the explosive inside, only caused a few very small, non-life-threatening injuries. Thus began the terrorist career of Ted Kaczynski, spanning the next 17 years, during which he targeted universities and airlines, hence the name Unabomber. His attacks resulted in the deaths of 3 people: computer store owner Hugh Scruton, advertising executive Thomas Mosser, and president of the California Forestry Association, Gilbert Brent Murray. But these are only the ones that actually passed away as a consequence of Ted's explosives, as many others were injured in a variety of ways. Besides these, there are other direct and indirect casualties of Ted's. Not only was he responsible for the deaths of some dogs poisoned around the area where he lived, he came very close to killing a toddler that lived nearby. The only reason he held himself back from doing it was because he knew he'd have to kill the rest of her family as well in order to prevent himself from being caught. Despite the notoriety of his attacks, Ted somehow remained free, due to the way he put his bombs together, how careful he was when delivering them, and how distant from civilization he was. The FBI was having a very difficult time putting the pieces of the puzzle together and discovering who the Unabomber was. That is, until Ted finished writing his manifesto and mailed it to some newspaper publications. Sitting at a whopping 35,000 words in length, the manifesto, which is more akin to a full-on book, was titled Industrial Society and Its Future. In it, he enshrines technological development as the root of all evil. While the contents of it can get highly specific when detailing the process through which technological development negatively and irreversibly alters how societies arrange themselves, one thing that really jumps out of the text is that Ted suffers from intense tunnel vision when it comes to this topic. There's little in the way of an idea of what exactly the world is supposed to be like, nor is there any coherent idea of what a move away from technology would even be in the first place. I guess his lack of dedicated thought toward that aspect of his worldview is what led him to conclude that blowing up a few random people was the best way to attain his objectives. In the place of a vision of the outcome of the revolution he proposes, there is only the glorification of the wilderness as a concept. Ironically, the pursuit of the wilderness for its own sake is as bad as the pursuit of technology for its own sake, as neither of them are particularly concerned with the well-being and convenience of human beings. At some point, the most advanced forms of technology were sharp sticks and fire, and those stood between thriving primitive communities and getting mauled by wild animals. This is kind of the problem with Ted Kaczynski's analysis in general, because whenever he comes up with a halfway decent criticism of how the world is, such as his description of over-socialization, you have to weigh that against the fact that he wanted to shoot a toddler just because she was near him. Another lowlight of his manifesto is his concept of the power process, which is so vague and arbitrary that it might as well have come from the Time Cube guy. All of this is without mentioning the fact that most, if not all of his ideas are borrowed and cobbled together from other modern thinkers, like the aforementioned Jacques Ellul, Sigmund Freud, and a few others. Lastly, it's also quite clear that Ted is almost exclusively familiar with modern psychology and philosophy, most of which comes from after the Industrial Revolution, which he rallies against relentlessly.
A new Planet Fitness is now open near you, and you can join for just $15 a month. We're talking a clean and spacious, judgment-free zone and brand new equipment. Join today. Now open in Carrollton. Join for just $15 a month. Offer ends June 27th.
You have heart in you. Things everywhere are raving about. Of Jar. It's one of the most profoundly beautiful films ever. Life of film masterpiece. It's a wonderful life for today.
This is quite ironic, since if he wanted to be diligent about his praise of the pre-industrial societies, he could have easily developed a much clearer image of what kind of world and people that kind of society produces. And he would have instantly learned that his vision didn't at all match that of pre-industrial philosophers. For example, Ted, a lifelong atheist, could never bring himself to adopt any religious beliefs, even if he felt tempted at times, especially during his time in the wilderness. His objection to it was that there was simply no scientific proof of there being a god, and in In this, he had a lot more in common with the post-industrial man than with the people he aspired to be, in an ultimate sense. Pretty much every prominent person before the Industrial Revolution was engaging with religion in one way or another, but his undying respect for the scientific method and early modern creation stood in Ted's way up until the day he died. Characterizations of Ted as someone who yearned to be a genuine hunter-gatherer or medieval peasant all fall short, since, despite his many objections to it, he was a product of the modern world through and through. He didn't leave society to live the life his ancestors would have lived, and people for just accidentally finding a way in his cabin in society with the full intent of continuing to engage with it, although this time in a hostile and destructive way. As an atomized individual, putting together fairly technologically sophisticated weapons, bombs. As pointed as his manifesto was, it fell flat and shallow, as its contents were chronically overshadowed by, well, the fact that he was blowing random people up via the mail. But I should say, there was one great thing that came from the publication of his manifesto, and that was his capture. At the beginning of this entry, I mentioned that Ted had a young brother, but only now does he come back. While Ted's mind decayed and his life spiraled apart, his brother David had a similar path, quitting his career as a school teacher to just live off the land for a few years. But unlike Ted, after 15 years of living in a cabin on a remote plot of land in Texas, when David's father passed away, he returned to society and embraced a normal life, which included rekindling his relationship with and eventually marrying his high school girlfriend, Linda. 5 years later, after the publication of Ted's manifesto, Linda read it and immediately suspected that Ted was the one behind it. When she told David of her suspicion, David also perused the text and felt the same way. At the time, the FBI was at an all-time high alert, and they were so desperate for tips that they were offering $1 million for anyone who could help them cache the Unabomber. But of the thousands of tips they received, only one panned out. David's, who led them directly to Ted's cabin in Montana, where he was promptly arrested. In his cabin, they found bomb components, 40,000 pages of Ted's journals, and a bunch of firearms and bombs. Following his capture, there was extensive discussion as to whether Ted was insane or not. But ultimately, the trial concluded in Ted pleading guilty to all charges and receiving a life sentence. During his time in prison, he not only continued to hold his anti-technology views, but also produced many new writings, although they mostly echoed his manifesto and added very little in the way of new ideas. He also befriended 2 other terrorists that he was imprisoned with. 700, and Ramzi Youssef, an Islamic terrorist whose innumerable acts of terrorism, including the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, are speculated to be responsible for the deaths of up to 30-something people and the injuries of over 1,000. After spending over 2 decades in prison, in 2021, Ted was diagnosed with rectal cancer, and after 2 years of consistently showing signs of depression, went out the same way his father did, taking his own life as a consequence of his poor cancer prognosis. Despite how tragic and catastrophic Ted's life turned out to be, he remains a person of interest in the cultural landscape to this day, with some people going as far as to show sympathy for his motivations and deeds. And obviously his writings and work, if you want to call it that, have also inspired a lot of pretty good memes. Very few criminals have ever attained the same degree of notoriety as Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, 2 high schoolers from Colorado who decided, for barely any justification besides their hatred for the world itself, to conduct an attack of unforeseen proportions on their high school. Darker still is the fact that they originally planned for bombings to have taken place that would have overshadowed what they managed to do with their firearms. But fortunately, they never developed the degree of expertise necessary to carry out that kind of thing. While many myths arose in the wake of their crime about how their deeds had something to do with bullying or social exclusion, the diary entries they wrote while in the lead up to the massacre served to clear it up, as both boys were pretty articulate as to why they thought they needed to do what they did. First, let's go over Eric's diary, which immediately starts out with a now completely redacted list of students, which Eric subtitled with the words, "Class of 98, top of the should have died list." This grim introduction is immediately followed by, "I hate the world. Too many goddamn in it. Too many thoughts and different societies all wrapped up together in this place called America. Everyone has their own opinions on everything. And you may be saying, well, what makes you so different? Because I have something only me and Dylan have. Self-awareness. We know what we are to this world and what everyone else is. We have been watching you people. We know what you think and how you act. Everything is so corrupt and filled with opinions and points of view and people's own little agendas and schedules. This isn't a world anymore. It's hell on earth and no one knows it." He sees himself as having a higher awareness than anyone in his surroundings surroundings, to the point where he claims he knows how they think and act, but at the same time, he expresses frustration about how many opinions and points of view there are. Being above something generally means that it doesn't affect you, but his frustration seems to stem from the fact that, despite his claimed superiority, he has absolutely no control, no power, over all of his perceived underlings. Immediately after, he once again alters his stance by complaining instead about how robotic people are and how everyone is a follower. To put it bluntly, there's barely any rhyme or reason to Eric's hatred for the world. With this kind of thing in mind, whatever deeper philosophical motivations anyone's ever ascribed to Eric amounts to little more than a rationalization. As a matter of fact, the things he's saying here are also rationalizations. Later on, when they got to recording their tapes, which I've actually covered in another video on my channel titled Homemade Videos with Disturbing Backstories, Eric bragged about how much he deceiving others, tricking them into thinking he was a nice guy. In his diary, he elaborated on this particular topic, saying, "I lie a lot, almost constant, and to everybody, just to keep my own ass out of the water. And by the way, I don't think I'm doing this for attention, as some people may think. Let's see, what are some big lies I've told? Yeah, I stopped smoking. I feel bad for doing it, not for getting caught. No, I haven't been making more bombs. No, I wouldn't do that. And of course, countless other ones. And yeah, I know I hate liars and I am one myself. Oh well. It's okay if I'm a hypocrite, but no one else. Because I am higher than you people. No matter what you say, if you disagree, I would shoot you." This is one of the most telling traits of someone who either has or is developing strong tendencies towards sadistic and psychopathic behavior. And like every sadist and
What the
psychopath,
fuck,
Eric
dude?
drastically overestimated his ability to deceive.
What the
As almost
God
exactly
damn
2
it.
years before the attack took place, Eric's father had taken notice of his erratic, violent, and otherwise inappropriate behavior and started keeping track of it in a log. Other people around
Alright.